All right. How's it going, everybody? We'll give people a few more moments to come on in. You see people are coming down the hall. Yes, one or two people. Give them a second to join us. In the meantime, if you happen to have any questions, I'm happy to do my best to try and answer them. We're going to cover a lot in the next 50 minutes, hour or so. I'm going to be talking about basic strategies, how they use these tests, the new computer adaptive SAT that's coming out, all that kind of stuff. But if you have any questions just in mind right now, I'm happy to try and answer them while we wait. Generally, yes, they do take that kind of commitment seriously. There's a number of reasons for it, and it has to do with every college's own special sauce on admissions. And because they have to create, so to speak, a class, right? And so each college has its own, so to speak, approach to doing that. So if a college says we're going to go test blind, they do mean it, because if they don't, their whole system starts to get very weird. And there's a lot of litigation worry out there these days. I'm sure if you're following some of the court cases about affirmative action type policies, test admission policies, use of tests, use of non-academic factors, all of that stuff has become highly litigious in the last 30 years. So the colleges are very, very scared. And there's also scuttlebutt about some of fixing going on in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. So a lot of colleges, Columbia, are very worried about what might come out in those regards. And I think that's why we saw Columbia become the first Ivy to go completely test optional. I think it was like a week or two ago. And there's rumors as to why that is, and I can't speak to the truth of them. They are all unfounded at this time, but part of that's because of what they, the way that the U.S. News and World Report rankings have kind of changed the way colleges do all of this stuff over the last 30 years, and finally starting to get more scrutiny on those policies. So that's a way of saying, to come back to your original question, yes, if they're test blind, you can trust them about that. And we'll talk a little bit about that, because right now things are more complicated than they have ever been, and they've never been simple. So with that, I'll just take a look out here and see if we have anybody coming down. We've got one coming on in. Let's go ahead and get started. This was originally, so hi everybody, my name is Matt. I am have been working as a private test prep tutor for 15 years in Burlington. This is actually my 14th year with College Pathways. And part of what we're going to be doing today is answering as many questions as we possibly can that everybody has here. And then after that, we're going to be talking about strategies. What are these tests? How are they used? What are colleges doing these days? And let me start out by saying, just make sure we got everybody in here. All right, so this is a hybrid session. So thank you very much for asking questions for the people who are watching remotely. But generally speaking, if you have questions during today's presentation, please feel free to raise your hand. This is a hot session. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. And let me make sure I have my microphone so everyone can hear me. And if for some reason I can't answer your question right here, I'm happy to stay afterwards and answer it. And for everybody, those here and those watching remotely, if you'll see on the front page of this little packet here, you will see my personal email address. You are very welcome to email me after this session with particular questions. I know some people nobody should ever be ashamed about asking a question, certainly with me. But if you do have some issues, if you are concerned about asking things, you can certainly email me. And let me also say this, my email inbox is a nightmare. So please, if you don't get a quick response, feel free to follow up and bother me. I do want to make sure everybody knows as much as possible about these tests as I can put into people's heads, because they're complicated. And seeing just people coming in. So yes, please feel free, go right ahead. Here it is right up front. Yeah, right at the bottom, right down there. Very good. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Hi, good morning, everybody. So we are talking about the SAT and the ACT. If you are here to learn about the SAT subject tests, I'm sorry, that session was several years ago. They no longer exist. Now it's all APs. So I don't know, that's a little humor for me, right? So moving right along, what are these tests? These are standardized tests. So what does that mean? essentially a standardized test is just a test where you are compared against other students. These are not IQ tests. These do not test any kind of G factor, genetic intelligence, nothing of the sort. They are just a question of where you stand in terms of your academic abilities at that moment compared to a cohort of your peers. So what does that mean? If you are starting your practice and preparation earlier, you can do better than other students. If you put more time preparing in for these tests than other students do, you can do better than them. But at the end of the day, what this is about putting a number that tells a college that you have a certain set of skills and really nothing more. The way colleges do these tests is something like this. So imagine for a moment, you go ahead and you walk in on test day and you're taking the test on National Take Your Pet to Test Day. So you have a really bad day when you take that test. You get one question correct on each section, but everybody else in that room is a nice, cute little puppy or kitten and they have no thumbs. They can answer nothing. They get all their questions wrong. What is your score on an SAT or an ACT if you have gotten one question right and everybody else has gotten them wrong? It is 800 or 36, technically under the way these tests are scored. Conversely, if it's take your genius to test day and you get every question right, but one on each section, but everybody else is levitating the pencils with their mind and there's little like sparks coming out of their ears, they get every question right. Your score is now 200 or 0 or 1, I should say. So it's about where you stand against the students who are taking the other tests. That's going to become especially true with the new computer adaptive test because the computer adaptive test is pre-normed before you go into that test room. And I'll talk about that in a second and what that means. But to start with the first question that I get, how do colleges use these scores? Do they take your best score? Do they look at your worst scores? And the answer is, at least this is nice, they always give you the benefit of the doubt using one of two methods. They either give you your best single time out score and ignore the rest, or they mix and match the sections to come up with a super score. The test companies, generally speaking, have recommendations on how colleges should use these things. For example, the ACT has never really approved the super score method. Colleges do what they want anyway, because at the end of the day, colleges are trying to put together classes. They want certain numbers of students in certain areas to be able to maintain their programs. So they want a certain number of English kids, a certain number of STEM kids, a certain number of performing arts kids. They want to put together a class. And so they use these things in different ways to come up with the classes that they want essentially attending on their campuses. So with that in mind, does it hurt you to retake a test? The short answer is no, it will never hurt you to retake a test. You may not want to, it may be miserable, absolutely, but you're not going to be penalized for it. And that's the important thing. Moving on to the test timeline. So generally speaking, how many juniors do we have here? Okay, very good. How many sophomores, if any? All right, so sophomores, you are in very good shape. You should be starting to think about taking your first practice test starting at the beginning of this summer and seeing where you stand. If you are juniors, you are looking at the first real opportunity to start some of your tests this spring, and you should at least start your practice. We don't have any seniors here, right? I'm very sorry, that train may have left the station if you are a senior. Otherwise, very good. So you want to go ahead and take a test, see how you do. The first thing that I want to say about taking any test is always take a practice test. Remember, these are time standardized tests. If you have to take time to read instructions or understand what you are doing, and other students can just dive right in and start their work, you are taking points out of your pocket and handing it to other students. So take a practice test, if for nothing else, just to know what you are doing before you walk into that test room. And who knows, maybe you'll put up a good enough score on your first test that you don't have to do any more. I want to talk a little bit, actually, that reminds me, what is a good score on these tests? And the answer is that there's approximately 3,500 four-year colleges in the United States. For the vast majority of them, for like 3,000 plus, a perfectly average score on these tests is perfectly acceptable. And generally speaking, my rule of thumb is that, and this is just kind of looking at a number, not really having any other sense of it. If you're, let me rephrase that. Your score percentage needs to be above the rejection rate. So in other words, if a school rejects 90% of their applicants, your test score should be above the 90th percentile, just as a rule of thumb to talk about, am I even in a ballpark for this particular type of competitive school? But the ultimate upshot is that most colleges are not looking for that, 750, 32 plus sort of range. They're looking for students who, generally speaking, are students who are in the bell curve, that big bubble in the center, and are able to demonstrate a reasonable degree of academic success on skills that they've already learned. So that's really a way of saying you shouldn't be panicking if your initial scores show that you're scoring in an average range if you are looking at most colleges. Obviously, check with your colleges. And in fact, that actually brings me to something that's a piece of advice that's really new. It's a post-COVID piece of advice. I never used to advise that students call their colleges and try to have a conversation with the admissions offices if they're worried about this kind of stuff. That's gone out the window. Testing is changing by the month these days in terms of what individual colleges are doing. The whole post-COVID landscape is just, every college is fending for itself, so to speak. So I would never usually recommend that, but if you have any questions, go ahead and call out to admissions offices. My kind of experience with them is they don't know what they're really doing right now either, and they're trying to figure it out, and they're pretty honest about that and willing to talk with students more than they used to. They used to just tell you, do the best you can, and that's it. They didn't really give you any further advice. Now they'll at least tell you where these scores are kind of in terms of their importance and whether or not you should keep retrying if you're in a certain range. They won't give you any guarantees, but they'll at least give you a sense of how they're using them more than they used to. Let's see. So in terms of new things, we have the new computer adaptive SAT coming out. I've been keeping an eye on the ACT. There is a computer adaptive ACT for international students. They don't seem to have brought it or have any immediate plans to bring it over to US students. So I think we can leave that out for the purposes of today's conversation. But in terms of the SAT, so juniors, you probably will not be looking at this. This is really more for the sophomores. But what is a computer adaptive test? So I'm sure everybody is familiar with the old Scantron. You got a booklet, it's got the questions, you got an answer sheet, you bubble in your answers. And, there's either 4 answer choices or there's 5 answer choices. Computer adaptive test does not work the same way. You do not get to see all the questions at once. You see one question at a time on a computer screen, and if you get it right, you get a harder question. If you get it wrong, you get an easier question. Your score is the difficulty of question that you end your assignment at. So if there's 35 questions and your last answer is a 750-point question, that is effectively how your score is determined. So it's a very weird feeling for students who are used to the old traditional booklet. You could skip questions that you didn't have time to do and come back to them if you did have time. There's a lot of strategies and optimization you can do on the old tests. It's just gone now with the computer adaptive test. Oh, yes, we have a question. Yes, we're going to wrap up on that topic. So I'm going to hold that question until a little later in the presentation, and we'll talk about where you can find practice materials. But the short answer is yes, go on both test companies' websites. College Board has partnered with Khan Academy, and if I remember correctly, ACT has partnered with Kaplan to put out free test materials that you can access on their websites. We'll chat a little bit more about that. But let me give you a piece of advice about the computer adaptive test. This is psychological. This is stress management. The computer adaptive test is very perverse. If you are doing well on it, it will feel like the hardest, most miserable test you have ever taken. That's because, again, the difficulty responds to your ability. So if you are feeling like you are failing this test, you're actually doing very well on it. Conversely, if you're seeing questions that are really easy and you feel like, oh, that's a breeze, chances are you're not doing very well because you are underperforming your difficulty capacity, so to speak. So psychologically, remember that. Don't panic when the test gets tough. You are doing great. Meanwhile, if this thing seems like a breeze and you're blowing through them, you are not being careful and you're getting a lot of questions wrong. So that's the kind of perverse psychology of a computer adaptive test. This is actually something that maybe more of the parents out here might be familiar with, because if you went to graduate school, you probably took the GRE or the GMAT. Those are computer adaptive tests as well. So that's kind of finally trickled down to the high school student level. So let me ask if there's any questions here so far. Yes, question in the back? No? Okay, very good. No, I'm just checking with the microphone there. Very good. Yes. So yes, in terms of the test administrations, generally there's about 10 to 14 administrations over the course of a year of each test, and you can retake both many times. I used to know off the top of my head how many ACTs you could take. It was like 14. And then you couldn't take any more because they just start kicking the old scores out. But it's basically they are offered multiple times a year. They're offered over the summer as well. And again, there's no penalty for retaking aside from the actual penalty of having to sit there and do it and pay money and all that misery. Let's see. Let us talk then about, so we are not actually, most of us, going to be taking the computer adaptive test. So I want to talk a little bit for the juniors in particular about what are we doing on these old tests in terms of guessing. So now I'll keep it really simple for the computer adaptive test for you sophomores. Guess the best answer you can on that question and move on. So that's the strategy for the computer adaptive test. Take your best shot, move on. Now, for the older test, for the paper-based test, the guessing strategy is a little different. If you don't know what the answer is to a question, if you're just not getting anywhere with it, skip it. Be careful and make sure you don't miss bubble, but skip that question for the time being. When you get to the end of the section, or if you have about 2 minutes left in your time, stop. Take a look at your answer sheet. Decide which of the answer choices you have answered the least, A, B, C, or D, or E, or whatever it may be. Answer that same letter into all of your blank bubbles. The answer choices on a standardized test are distributed equally across all of the options. So if you are looking at your answer sheet and you see one answer choice that you don't feel you have answered as much as the others, that is by statistical probability overrepresented in the blanks. So if you guess the letter that you feel you have answered the least into those blanks, you will have optimized your completely blind, no insight into the question guessing strategy. It is not a huge difference. It is going to bring up your score maybe 1 or 2 questions over just guessing on each question blind as you come across it, but every little bit helps. So that's the optimum guessing strategy for the old paper-based tests. Wait till the end of each section, take a look at your answers, pick the letter you have answered the least, and enter that one into all of your blank questions. Yes, sir. Not for the sophomores taking the SAT. They're the ones who will likely be taking the computer adaptive test. For the time being, ACT should remain paper-based. Spent some time over the last week checking to see if they've made any announcements about rolling the international computer adaptive test for US students. Nothing seems to be in the works, so just the SAT for the time being. Any questions so far? So we're not going to take a whole lot of time looking at, oh, good. There we go. We're not going to take a whole lot of time taking a look at these scores. I just want to basically show everybody how they do this stuff and what the numbers mean very broadly. Here's the ACT. You can see over here, you've got, your perfect scores, 100th percentile, which really mathematically is impossible. Don't know why they published it that way, but it is what it is. In any event, you can see right up here at the top. Now coming down here, this is about your 50th percentile range. So this is what, half of students are going to score, better than, and half lower than, right around this range here. Most colleges that I have seen most students in my career looking at are here in this range. The vast majority of colleges are perfectly fine with the 24s through the 22s. And then as you start to get to your competitive colleges, it's going up and around this way for most of your big public schools that are nonetheless competitive. And then you start getting into your highly competitive private school range up top. Yes, that's a good question. So yes, so taking a look here, you can see the composite. 22 is about the 65th percentile range. 20th is right around that 50th percentile range across the different subcategories. And 26 to 28 is where you're in those middle and upper 80th percentile ranges. This is usually where, if you're looking at a competitive public school, this is usually where your targets are going to be. And then if you're looking at a private, highly competitive school, the 30s and up are where you want to be in terms of your percentages. Okay, I'm going to move real quickly onto the SAT just so you can see those composites right there. And again, the composite is just a means of getting a percentile. The percentile is the real thing that the schools are looking at, broadly speaking. For the time being, I haven't really heard of any colleges that care so much about the sub-scores. Like they break the critical reading down into various categories. They break the math into various subcategories. I don't know colleges are putting more emphasis on like the algebra section high difficulty questions versus the trigonometry high difficulty questions. So it's really about your overall percentile in terms of what you want to be thinking about. Okay. And these are the scores on the SAT by subsection, as opposed to composite. And let me go ahead and talk a little bit about these scores. And you can see, so here is around the 500 mark. And as you can see, that's just about the 50th percentile range at that 500. And then as you go up to about the 650 range. That's where you hit the 90th percentile at around 650. And then up at 700, you're in the upper 90s. And then up above that, you're in the kind of nosebleed percentiles. Any questions, broadly speaking, about the scores and the percentiles that go with them? Again, the percentiles are what the colleges really need. The scaling is a means of getting to that. There we go. So we've talked a little bit about the need to take a practice test before you walk into that test room. And again, it's not a sophisticated idea. These are timed, they're comparison tests. You need to take time reading instructions. That's going to help somebody else score better than you. So take a practice test so you just know what you're doing, if for nothing else. You will find that if you are just taking practice tests, your score will go up after the first 2 or 3 practice tests, and then it will start to plateau. We're going to talk about how you move past that plateau, but definitely take at least 1 and really probably 2 or 3 before you get into that test room. But just to come back to this, both test makers make tests available online, including the SAT. They have put out those computer adaptive tests, so you can try them on the website. If you are a sophomore and you're curious about what that looks like, what that feels like, you can take that, and I would strongly recommend it. I've toyed with the idea of recommending that students who are looking for higher percentages, kind of sophomores, maybe think about taking GREs just for kind of the kicks of it. It's a computer adaptive test, and it's way more similar to the SAT than people would like to acknowledge, because you have the idea of like, well, I'm going to graduate school. It must be completely different stuff, right? No, it's not. It's really not. It's still the same core critical reading. It's still the same core math concepts. It is not as far from the SAT as graduate students would probably like to think, but that's not currently my recommendation, just because Hopefully there will be enough test materials for the new SAT that you don't have to go scrounging at oats for optometrists to have enough critical reading practice. So that's the basics about making sure you get the tests. College Board website for the SAT, ACT Inc. College Board website for the SAT, ACT Inc. for the ACT. And let's go ahead. And so, yes, question. Absolutely. And so the answer to that question, so the question was, do I recommend taking the tests on the computer if they're an old paper-based test? So if you're a junior and you're going to be taking the paper SAT, can you take those tests on the computer? And the answer is you can. I would recommend getting the paper book because, again, you want to practice the modality you're actually being assessed in. So if you're doing it on paper, you want to practice on paper. Meanwhile, if you're doing it on the computer, you do want to practice on the computer. Now, let me be a little clearer here. When I say practice, I shouldn't say practice. I should say take diagnostics. And we're going to talk about the difference between diagnostic testing to see where you stand versus the things you should be doing to be improving your scores with practice. So, because generally speaking, when I work with students, we take the practice test to see where students stand and to identify the core areas we want to be targeting, but I don't drill tests. You take the first test to see where you stand, and then we start doing really core academic tutoring. There's usually like an hour or two of kind of test strategy stuff. What is this thing? How do I approach it? It's a lot of what we're doing here today in a little bit slower format. Otherwise, it's academics. We are practicing how do you break down passages to understand main idea, main characters, why an author is using a particular technique. We do a lot of math tutoring, a lot of review of formulas. It is nuts and bolts academic work that you really want to be doing for the lion's share of your practice for these tests. Just taking test after test after test will run out in terms of its impact in improving your score pretty quickly. So that's why I want to transition to talking a little bit about the content areas. Let's see, we got about half an hour left. Okay, doing okay. So these are the basic categories. Broadly speaking, in terms of your math career, if you are on a normal mathematics track, you will probably have learned all the math that you need for both tests by about the end of your junior year. There may be some concepts that you're not seeing on the upper end, such as trigonometry, until the beginning of your senior year. And again, your mileage will vary depending on what your teachers cover, what classes you're taking, what track you're on. But generally speaking, most students will have most skills exposed to them by the end of their junior year to be able to start attacking this. Both tests' highest difficulty questions wind up in trigonometry. The SAT also asks a lot of questions these days about functions and function notation. The idea is the function is the beginning of computer programming, the instruction in math. And so that's where they kind of set the higher difficulty. Used to be, back in the old days, high difficulty geometry. They've really moved away from geometry on both tests because we're just not a country that has a lot of people in shop class anymore. So geometry doesn't have the same impact for employability as functions and trigonometry do, because they're kind of the beginnings of computer programming. So the SAT currently includes free response math questions. My understanding is they are getting rid of those for the computer adaptive test. And in terms of what you're going to see, I want to talk a little bit about remainders, odds and evens, exponent rules, prime numbers, roots. Those are what I call the basic or fundamental concepts. Those are not the easy concepts. Those are concepts that you will see if you do take a practice GRE, just for the heck of it, that you will see on the GRE making up high difficulty questions. Because if I go ahead and I take a number and I put it to an exponent, and then I put a root inside of it, and then I put a fractional exponent on it, and I say to you, simplify that, it gets hard, even though it is a quote, basic concept for algebra and mathematics. They're called numbers properties. So make sure that you review what happens when I raise something to a positive exponent. What happens when I raise it to a negative exponent? What happens when I raise it to a fractional exponent? What happens when I have nested exponents? So I'm raising an exponent to an exponent. That kind of stuff can be tricky. After that, you've got one variable and two variable algebra. You may see a question that has three variables. It is probably not as hard as you may think. It's usually just algebraic manipulation, finding one particular variable and then solving that. But generally speaking, one variable and two variable. So that's where lines intercept, that old y equals mx plus b stuff. You will see quadratics. And in fact, you'll see here on this sheet, I've gone ahead and put a whole bunch of basic math concepts that you will see on the test that have to do with quadratics. You'll see the old quadratic equation is right there, and all of your binomials and doing all your foiling, or the box as it may be. If you've been learning this approach in the last few years in Northwest Vermont, they use the boxes instead of the old foiling rainbows. Anyway, I'm rambling a little. There is not a whole lot of statistics. It is generally mean, mode, median, and then understanding what the idea of a standard deviation is. You do not have to actually memorize the formula for standard deviation. A little bit of probabilities and statistics with combinations and permutations. And geometry, we'll talk a little bit. Here's a formula bank here, which has all the geometry formulas you need. I apologize, it's a little small, but the formula bank that's hardest to read, this one up here, is taken from the College Board's formula bank in its tests. So if you get one of those big, thick blue books to practice SATs, that formula bank will be at the beginning of each test. So with that, you do have a formula bank on the old SAT. How do you practice with a formula bank? So one thing that I find students tend to make a mistake on is that obviously when you're taking a diagnostic test, if the formula bank's not supposed to be there, don't have it. You need to actually practice, if you're doing a diagnostic under test conditions. But if you're practicing to improve your math, to learn math, you're just doing questions, always have the formula bank next to you, because there is no point in taking a math question that you could have gotten right if you knew the formula and just not getting it right on your own practice at home. You want to practice taking the question apart. You want to practice reading the question. There's a lot more than just memorizing the formula that's good to practice. So you have the formula bank next to you when you do your practice. Make a mark next to the formula that you have to refer back to every time you look at it. And the reason why is because you'll eventually have a list of check marks next to the formulas you need to memorize for test day. It's a way of diagnosing yourself and figuring out what formulas you don't have down well enough so that you memorize just those formulas the week before your test. So if you're taking a test for diagnostics, do whatever the test maker says. If you are doing practice just to improve your math score, always have a formula bank. Always put a mark next to the formulas every time you look back at them, and you will start to know which formulas you don't have down well enough, and you can focus on those for test day instead of just overwhelming your mind, looking at this sheet, trying to memorize every formula, including the ones you already know. Again, a little bit of working smarter rather than harder. Coming up then on critical reading. Broadly speaking, you have 4 types of passages. This is what each of those passage types focus on. The first one is prose fiction. That's taken from short stories or novels. They are going to be focused on characters. How do authors create characters and give them unique personalities? What are the relationships between the characters? What are the attitudes and opinions of the characters relative to each other? You want to focus on characters in those prose fiction passages. I've had students who struggle with literacy do surprisingly well on prose fiction passages, and we're going to talk about how you mark up your passage, but just circling the characters every time they appear, because it helps them focus on those characters and look more quickly for what the questions are asking about. Authors create characters. The passages aren't long enough for questions about plot. And they can't assume that you have background knowledge for questions about allusions or references. And there's very, very, very few questions about literary techniques. And they don't usually require you to know terminology. Prose fiction is about characters and characterizations. Social science is about evaluating arguments, usually in some real world topic like economics, history, politics. Urban design is a very popular category. And what you are really doing is examining how expert arguments are presented and criticized. So let's imagine something about how we have too many parking spots and we need to get rid of parking spots so we have more walkable communities. There will be an expert who is the author of that passage, often summarizing and taking kind of a neutral perspective, but sometimes not. Sometimes the author of a social science passage will take a clear position. Then they will engage with other experts. They will say, traditionally, people like Robert Moses believed parking needed to be plentiful even in our densest cities. That is an expert summarizing an opinion of an expert, and then they will probably criticize that opinion. That is what the social sciences passages are looking for. After that, you've got humanities. Humanities are nonfiction art writing. So literary criticism, music theory, sculpture and visual arts history, biographies of artists, autobiographies by artists. Artists talking about their own processes and creative processes, and also what that means in terms of the art they create. Usually what you have is somebody talking about their own experience or an artist's experience and influences and how they changed their art over time. The changes are the big thing you want to focus on, because it is essentially, the passages are about opinions in humanities, right? There's no facts in art. You can't say one thing's prettier than another. How do you evaluate opinions and critical assessments that one person holds and compare it to a work of art or to another creative writer, another theorist, another critic's opinions about that art? So evaluating opinions and who holds them. After that, natural science. This is probably the one that you're most familiar with in terms of your reading here as Vermont students. A lot of science literacy in Vermont, I've found. Very straightforward. Here's a phenomenon in space. Here's a story about, volcano researchers. Here's how earthquakes happen. Here's an article about an invasive species in Maryland or something like that. What they are trying to get you to understand with natural science is, what is a hypothesis? How do scientists then research this topic? And what have they discovered from their research? How has the theory changed in response to research or to a study? Sorry? 7 minutes, good times. All right. So let's move this along. Very common question in the critical reading. Do I read the passage first? Do I read the questions first? What do I do here? And the answer is, you always read the passage first. On the computer adaptive test, you're not going to have an option. There's only going to be one question. You can't read the questions first. So you want to read the passage first, and you want to try and break it down, generally speaking, by its major components. Let me see here. This is a passage that I personally have broken down in what I think is an aggressive but not impossible note-taking. And pretty much anything that works for you, do it. If underlining a section works, underline. If drawing arrows works, draw arrows. But the most important places that you want to be focusing, the first paragraph and last paragraph, followed by the first sentence of each body paragraph and the last sentence of each body paragraph. overwhelmingly the important information is going to be conveyed by those portions of the passage. And I have had students who struggle with literacy just read those sections and then underline that first line of each paragraph if it's a big paragraph and the last, and really be able to succeed in getting through those passages timely by reading less, more intelligently, and then just coming back to the passage if they have a question and they go right to the portion of the passage that the question asks about, instead of like rereading the whole passage, looking for this whole thing. You go, okay, I know this question is going to be somewhere in this passage, somewhere in this paragraph, and I'm just going to look right there. And that's going to take me a lot less time than reading the question, skimming the paragraph, going to the next question, skimming the paragraph, going to the next question, skimming the paragraph, which is what you end up doing if you go question first rather than passage first. So read the passage first quickly, trying to mark major points in the passage, not even necessarily digesting them, just getting yourself ready to look back to that passage quickly, just at a single portion of it, rather than going through it again and again and again, like you will if you go question first. Let's see. SAT has linked questions. And so what they will say is, what was the author's opinion about this thing? Where in the passage do you find support for that? That second question depends on the first question. But here's the catch. If you were to have read that second question first, you would know the 4 places in the passage that could be the answer for your first question, right? Because the second question asks you, where in the passage do you find support for your answer to the first question? And it gives you 4 locations. If you work backwards, if you do that second question first, you now know the 4 locations where the answer is hiding for the first question. So when they have a question that goes, what is the author's opinion about this? And the next question is, where in the passage do you find support for that answer? If you can discipline yourself to skim on the old SAT, the paper SAT, just enough to see those questions, those are the ones that are the exception, identify those linked questions, because then when you get to that question, you look at question 2 first, then you look at question 1, answer question 1 in light of the 4 answers offered in question 2. So a little bit again of breaking down the test to take it smarter rather than harder. Yes. Paper-based. Paper-based SAT and for the ACT, so the new computer adaptive test, won't be able to do that anymore, unfortunately. The multiple choice writing sections. Multiple choice writing, so this is English here, not critical reading. The multiple choice writing, is going to be merged in the new SAT into the verbal section, so you will still have these questions. The English section on both tests is asking for, they're going to give you a little underlined section of a sentence, and then they're going to give you 4 options. One option is going to be no change usually. The other options are going to be revisions of that underlined section. What they're looking for in every single grammar question on these tests are the most correct, concise, and relevant answers. Correct means it's correct. There's not really much of a surprise there. Relevant means your answer is not changing the meaning of the sentence. That's actually a really rare issue. You don't usually have to worry about that, but if an answer does change the meaning of the underlined section, be very, very, very careful about it because it's usually wrong. The secret here is concise. Both tests have a bias over word count length. If 2 answer choices are both grammatically correct, but one is shorter than the other by word count, the shorter one is always correct. Always. They have a bias. Good authors do not use unnecessary words. That's where they come from in terms of this testing method. So if you have 2 answer choices, both seem grammatically correct, try to count the words if you have time. If not, just straight, which one of them looks shorter if you're running out of time. But the shorter answer choice is always correct. I have seen this be a huge impact on student scores. I had one student one time who always picked the longest answer choice. He was a very talented author. From one test to the next, his score went from 19 to 27. That's how powerful, if you're doing this completely backwards, it is on the test. And if you are working from your shortest English answer choice to your longest, when you hit your first grammatically correct answer, you're done with that question. You don't need to look at the other options. So try to work from your shortest answer choice to your longest answer choice on the English questions. And if one fits, that's it, you're done. Yes, so that's the digital. In terms of the grammar, so let me be careful. We got 10 minutes left, I think. No, oh, we're wrapping up. Okay, got you. Okay, so everything in terms of the grammar to know. Subject verb agreements, pronouns and prepositions, punctuation and usage in terms of this. So let me skip kind of what I've got wrapped up here, because what I've got left is the essays on both tests. They're getting rid of the essay on the new SAT. Yes, they are getting rid of that. SAT essays about rhetorical analysis. They give you a passage. You have to analyze why the author wrote what they wrote in order to convince the reader of whatever it is they want to convince the reader about. Yes, so those are broken down. I hate that I did such good work on trying to break out the essay and they're just getting rid of it. It's lousy. Anyway, ACT, so their essay is going to be about 3 positions, 3 opinions. You generally have to pick one and advocate for it and make sure you address criticisms from the other 2 positions. So pick a position, advocate for it, rebut the other 2 positions, and remember on the ACT essay, you can make up facts. You can completely make up facts. It is a total writing exercise. It is not a do you know this stuff exercise. If something sounds good and you can make it support a position on your ACT essay, just make it up and write it down, because again, this is about showing that you're going to be in college in a few months. Do you know how to write an organized essay answer in your college classrooms when you're taking your midterms? It's not about what's true. It's about pure construction and showing you know the steps to answer an essay question, not about what you know. Science section on the ACT, it is tricky, but it's about data analysis. There's only 1 or 2 questions across the whole test that have to do with science background knowledge. It is data analysis. Can you read a chart? And do you know what the scientific method is? Hypothesis, test structure, so you have control and dependent variables, then analyzing data. All right, so resources. I'm very sorry to be so rushed, everybody. I want to make sure that we try to give as much away as we can here in this session in terms of knowledge and tricks. But here is the last set of resources. So the College Board has the Blue Book. They have now also putting online computer adaptive tests up. So whether you're taking the paper test or the new SAT, you can obtain the printed resources. You can print them off the website. Or if you're taking the computer test, they have little software modules you can load up and practice the computer adaptive test. ACT, very straightforward. You get the big red book. It is all practice ACTs that have been really used. Khan Academy, that's through College Board. Kaplan through ACT Inc. Those companies are helping their respective test makers create practice materials. ACT and SAT pamphlets, those are in your guidance department. You can get actual on-the-spot practice pamphlets, usually from your guidance counselors, that contain entire whole tests. And then these are older resources for vocabulary building. One of the things we do when I work with students and we have more time to prepare is we work on vocabulary building, because critical reading, if you don't know the words you're reading, just as a matter of vocabulary, you're not going to understand what it is that you're actually reading overall. So if you are a sophomore, if you are a junior and you've got some time, start building vocabulary. That's where Free Rice comes in. That's a vocabulary building website. And then Greek and Latin roots in English. We just steal other words and fragments from other languages here in English. So knowing Greek and Latin roots can really help you break down difficult vocabulary. And folks, that is it. I'm happy to stay after and answer any questions. Again, I apologize for the rush. This was originally an hour and a half long presentation, and I just try to put as much into it as I can. So that is an invitation to you all to feel free to email me questions or come talk to me afterwards. Otherwise, everybody, good luck and enjoy the rest of today. Thank you. No problem.